Welcome. Welcome to the first session of the Just Zero Conference, an international event focusing on the role of finance in the just transition to net zero. My name is Nick Robbins. I'm a professor in practice for sustainable finance at the LSE's Grantham Research Institute. The conference is organised by the Grantham Research Institute, along with the Initiative for Responsible Investment at the Centre for Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School, the Principles of Responsible Investment, and the International Trade Union Confederation. Other partners include CDC, the Institute for Human Rights and Business, the Place-Based Climate Action Network, the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and the conference is supported by the Friends Provident Foundation. With COP26 starting in less than a week in Glasgow, this opening session will focus on why supporting a just transition is a question of leadership for policymakers, for business, trade unions, civil society, and not least for finance. And to show us what this leadership looks like, I'm delighted to be joined by a group of 4 leaders themselves. Firstly, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll make some opening remarks. Firstly, we'll have Sharan Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Welcome, Sharan. Next, we'll have Laura Martin, who is Director of Spain's Just Transition Institute, which is an autonomous body of the Ministry for Ecological Transition. Unfortunately, Spain's Deputy Prime Minister, Teresa Ribera, was unable to attend at the last moment, and she sends her apologies. But you're very welcome, Laura. Very welcome. We'll also have next Brian Motherway, who is Head of Energy Efficiency at the International Energy Agency, and Brian is also the lead for the IEA's Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions. Sadly, Fatih Birol sends his apologies due to an unforeseen diary conflict. And again, Brian, you are very welcome. And finally, last but not least, Fiona Reynolds, Chief Executive Officer of the Principles of Responsible Investment, which has been really leading work on the role of investors in the just transition for a number of years now. So we will have a fairly straightforward session in terms of logistics. We'll hear some initial remarks from Sharan, Laura, Brian and Fiona, and then there'll be a chance for you to ask your questions. Please put your questions in the question and answer function. I will try and answer as many as possible. Just to say, this session is being recorded, and obviously we can share that link later. So without further ado, I'd like to get into the heart of the matter and turn to you, Sharan. You've been a real leader, champion for just transition as a critical enabling factor for climate success. Why is that so important? And particularly, what are your expectations on the role of the finance sector as we head into COP26 on just transition? So Sharan, please, over to you.
So thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for all the work everybody on this panel and many more do. I don't have to remind any of us that we're in a race against time. And if we have to actually stabilise the planet by getting to a net zero future, then we have to do more than half of that work by 2030. We will not get that work done if we don't have the trust of the people for whom it involves and the impact on them and their families, but their communities as well. So when we talk about no stranded assets, I remind people that's all very well, but we can't have stranded assets or stranded communities either, or we are simply not accepting that this is the biggest systematic change that we will see in our lifetime that involves all sectors, energy as a foundation, of course, but all sectors. And that if we're serious about it, we have to put people and the planet on an equal or indeed even more important footing than profit. So, and why do you have to do that? I don't think I have to explain to investors or the business community, just as we don't have to explain to workers that there are no jobs on a dead planet. There is no business on a planet that is simply unstable, on which you can't ensure a future, let alone conduct a global business with any kind of security. So what does that mean? Well, we think it's pretty simple. It actually means, first of all, you have to talk to the people involved. You have to secure their trust with the kind of agreements around transition. And nobody can talk on this panel about that better than Laura, because with Teresa's leadership, Laura indeed spent innumerable hours, first of all, talking to the coal miners in Spain and their communities, but then in other sectors now as well. But it's painful. It's really painful. But the reality is, if all investment doesn't have an ESG lens, we will fail. It's that simple. We'll fail the test of the time frame to stabilise the planet. We'll fail people, and I don't have to explain to anyone that at the moment, if you look around the world, that the despair is coming from an anger that is really, really hard to undo unless people are involved and see themselves as part of the future. And of course, you have to say that we're all in this together. It's not just business, it's the investors in business. Workers have around 40 trillion or more now of their actual pension funds, workers' capital, we say, invested in the global economy. They want to have a secure return, so it has to mean that our business approach is secure from an investor's point of view, that we invest in companies that are going to have a secure future, and that people and the outcomes of the investment are for good and not indeed for simply the old notion that shareholder profit at any cost must reign. And of course, governments have a role in this, because both the businesses investors invest in and the governments have real procurement power. And if they use that procurement power, then they can make a difference in terms of the way in which the investments are considered, assessed, monitored, and indeed contractual reviews are structured. But of course, Nick, there's other things. I can say to you, what does a just transition require? It's not some magical concept that people have to really think too deeply about. You have to say, is there engagement with your workers? Is there social dialogue? Is in fact are the ILO guidelines for just transition being followed around respect for rights? But it actually means, are you thinking about where the jobs are through this transition? If there are jobs that you can secure and protect, and it's one of the reasons I'm very frustrated with the fossil fuel companies. They have the resources, they have the technologies, they have the platforms to actually transition to renewable energies faster than they are doing and secure and indeed increase jobs, because we know that dollar for dollar, there are more jobs in renewable energy and clean technologies than there are in the current fossil fuel jobs outcomes. And we know that if we've got that union and employer relationship, they can be quality jobs. They can be good quality union jobs that mean people will get good wages, they'll get safety, they'll get appropriate benefits and so on. So jobs have to be at the centre, but they've got to be climate friendly jobs, and they've got to come with just transition. Of course, for workers who will be displaced, and you can't lie to workers, there will be displacements. But indeed, for workers who are displaced, if they're older workers, then their pensions must be secure. If they opt for voluntary retirement because they're not too far off retirement, you need that bridge to secure pensions. If in fact they are younger workers, they need security. That means income security, it means reskilling support and redeployment support. And it means no company can just walk away from their assets in fossil fuel industries. They have to take account of their responsibility for repatriation of the land that provides some years of work and security for communities. They have to take responsibility for replacing coal-fired power stations with indeed renewable energy infrastructure, and so the list goes on. But if they're not jobs with rights, with social protection and with equality, and there's a good news story here for women. Collectively, women have lost $900 billion through the pandemic, Nick. If they were in fact treated equally, then not only would they recover that, but equal participation of women would get us some $13 trillion invested. So these are not huge areas of magic. They're actually got to be worked out with plans, with agreements, with transparency, and everybody, governments, employers, ourselves, investors, have to be on the spot. And I'll finish by simply saying, Nick, we are really grateful to Fiona and you for the work you've done around pushing investors to consider and sign up to just transition commitments. We need more of it. We now need all investment, as I said, to have a regulatory frame with an ESG lens. And Brian, I'm really grateful to you for the work you're doing with the IEA. This is timely, and it says that people who, you know, are committed to the energy industry know that we have to have a much more holistic approach. And of course, to Teresa, Ribera, and my very old friend Laura, they've set the scene. They've set the standards. They know what it's like to negotiate through difficult terrain with unions and employers and community. And I love talking to the energy community in Spain because there's a new energy community there that is so much more visionary and has a human-centered approach. So it's not easy. And then we have to think about the fiscal space for developing countries, but that's possible too, with shared technology and the fiscal space with partnerships through the IFIs and so on. But it takes planning.
Brilliant, Sharon. Well, thanks so much, and thanks for sort of acknowledging everyone else on the panel. That's very generous of you. I'm going to turn to you now, Laura Martin, Director of the Just Transition Institute in Spain. Many of us have looked to Spain and the work you've been doing. It'd be really good to hear from you what are the sort of key lessons and key priorities for Just Transition in Spain and indeed the wider European Union? And particularly, where do you see the financial sector sort of contributing to the next phase of action on Just Transition? So Laura, welcome, and over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Yes, the minister is unfortunately, but she cannot be here with us. She's very committed to Just Transition, and maybe that we have a Just Transition Institute that I have the honor to direct the first sign that the commitment we have with this agenda. As Sharan has said, we need to be able to develop a transition that is above all just and beneficial for workers, for consumers, and for citizens. And we have to make the case for that. It's not only about guaranteeing the transition for polluting industries to energies that are green and clean, and that is very important. But with that, we don't do the complete change we need. So we have to guarantee jobs. We have to create more and better jobs in this transition. We have to reskilling workers in an inclusive manner, and we have to distribute the costs of the transition. And as Sharan has said, Just Transition is about putting the well-being and the benefit of people at the center, but also it's about being honest and anticipate the change. Do not deny the change, but confront the change and being honest about the different effects that this change is going to bring to different people, to different territories, to different sectors. And the measures, of course, have to focus on the most vulnerable.
Laura, sorry to interrupt. Your video is off. If it can be turned on, it'd be great to see you as well as hear you. Sorry to interrupt. That's fantastic. I was being honest. You said be honest. I said be honest.
I'm sorry. I was just okay.
So back to you.
So the measures have to focus on the most vulnerable, Nick, and we have to do two things: reversing the negative effects, what is difficult, but also solving the distributional problem in the medium term. And that is what we are trying to do in the Just Transition Institute. The social cost of carbon cannot be borne only by some citizens and by some workers. So Spain has been developing a set of responses. You know that we have an ambitious Just Transition strategy that was presented at the same time that the climate change and transition energy law. So we put both things together at the same level. As this, it's as important to have a climate change law than a Just Transition strategy, and we are implementing this first Just Transition strategy. But also what we did is in the law we recently approved of climate change and energy transition, we include a full title of just transition. So the Title 6 of our new law oblige the state to present these just transition strategies every 5 years. So we are looking really for this legal obligation that guarantee a dynamic framework for anticipating the challenges and honestly committed to solve these challenges. Well, as a result of this just transition strategy, the one that we are implementing now in Spain, in just these last years, we are successfully closing 85% of our electricity coal capacity, and we are moving fast to the complete phase out. And what is more important is not only phasing out coal, but doing it with peaceful agreements where everybody is on board between companies, trade unions, regional and local entities, and the government. And I think we are closing. We are getting there. We work with all of the different territories affected and with different workers in what we call just transition agreements that have this local level. And what we want to do is boosting the economic activity in those places. Challenging, of course, direct investments, supporting also innovative industrial projects. They have to be the industrial projects of the future, supporting the SMEs, but also guaranteeing specific solutions for workers. And that is also important. It's not only about creating jobs and creating new activity, but also having the time to put a specific solution for the workers that are involved. And we also are looking for specific solutions for other groups like women or young people that are really very much the future of these areas, above all when we are doing this transition in sectors that are male dominated. So bringing women in this new economy, in these new sectors is important. In the short term, it is not only about workers and where we have the challenges, but also we are seeing that the change can generate social tensions or turbulence, for instance, now due to high electricity prices that we are looking at the European level. And to tackle these tensions, government must deliver urgent solutions to minimize impacts on households also and industries of these electricity prices. And we are really in Spain very much at this particularly moment trying to transfer in the benefits of this cleaner and cheaper energy that we know that we are putting into place to the bills of the citizens and the industry. And it has to be now, because otherwise people will not be continuing supporting the challenge. So what is the just transition we are pushing for? Well, a just transition that managed to meet the climate objectives, and that is fast, that means now, but improving people's lives. And we have to focus on quality employment, and as I said, reduce energy bills and costs for companies and families. That has to be also as fast as the decarbonization efforts, and generate this new sustainable fabric. So that is what we are working in Spain. About your question about how the financial sector can help, well, it is important that the real economy reacts to these needs, and the finance sector has started, fortunately, to move in this direction. And much more has to be done, but we are starting to move. It is essential to ensure that 100% of our economic activities and financial flows are compatible with the climate security, with the Paris Agreement, and we have to put a lot of attention in all investment flows, both public and private. Of course, public finance has a fundamental role to play in leading this change. Above all, and in the anticipation space, investments portfolios from finance institutions have to be aligned with the Paris Agreements. Multilateral development banks have a key role to play in this coming forward. And the truth is that it's not only about responsibility towards our environment or towards our climate. It is really a business case, and it is a business case for leading investors and company. I think in Europe we have now, some important steps. The European Investment Bank is setting a benchmark in this regard. It's is becoming a climate bank, and that is very important, with a strong commitment to 1 trillion investment in climate action. The European Central Bank also considers climate impacts as macroeconomically relevant, and that is also very important. Even the recovery plan is putting or is bringing a lot of funds towards this accelerated decarbonization process, and it has to be done, and it has also to be careful how we do it. And I think also at the European level we had also some steps taken, for instance, with the European Union taxonomy, to identify and.
Well, I'm afraid you have 1 minute to go.
Okay, I'm finishing. For example, the European taxonomy or the European Green Bond Standard. I think there are steps in this path of having good examples of how the investment sector can come on board. And much more has to be done. But what is also true is that there are existing instruments already on the table that can be scaled up through the whole system. So thank you very much, Nick, and I will be happy to keep on sharing questions and answers.
Fantastic, thanks so much. And I think it's really good, your point that sort of just transition is part of this whole process of finance being aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. I think that was really, really good. Fantastic. So if I could move from Madrid, I assume, to Paris, to you, Brian. I think people have obviously been really struck by the analysis coming out from the IEA recently, the World Economic Outlook and so on, but also this process of emphasizing the need for the clean energy transition to be inclusive. So really good to get an insight in some of those emerging themes that are coming out of your Global Commission. And again, particularly where you see finance playing a role. So Brian, please, over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, but it's also a real privilege to be among such esteemed and articulate fellow speakers. So thank you for the opportunity. As you say, Nick, we're analysing everything at the moment. In this moment, we are just days before COP, and the last year has seen a lot of build-up of momentum. We've seen a lot of announcements about net zero targets, higher levels of climate ambition. All of that is very welcome, but at the same time, we're not seeing that turning into the right kind of action on the ground. And in fact, in 2021, CO2 emissions from energy will go up. In fact, this year, we'll see a rise in energy-related emissions that's one of the highest in decades. This is not where we need to be going. And therefore, our focus in the IEA is working with governments around the world to really understand how to design and implement the policies that will get us moving on the path towards the ambition that governments have stated. And so we're putting a lot of emphasis on, if you want to deliver what you've stated you want to deliver, here's what you have to do to get there. And of course, a key component is what we're talking about here today. And I don't need to reiterate why Laura and Sharan have articulated it very well. The core centrality of people in clean energy transitions. There's no concept of trying to address climate change if it's not about people and for people. And equally, the fact that we won't have any chance whatsoever of succeeding on this path if we are not going down paths that are acceptable and beneficial to people, that involve people. And so that's the framing for why our executive director earlier this year established the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions, to bring again together people with many different perspectives, many different points of view, but all in the midst of this process of thinking about clean energy transitions, but also particularly learning from them about how to make them fully people-centered. So our membership includes many energy and climate ministers from big countries, small countries, energy producers, energy importers. It includes, of course, Teresa Ribera as a very esteemed member, and Sharan Burrow as a really leading member. We're led under the tutelage of the Danish Prime Minister, and the Commission is chaired by the Danish Energy Minister and co-chaired by the Senegalese Energy Minister. So they've been working for the last 9 months to really boil down their experience and wisdom into some action-oriented recommendation to others who find themselves ready to address the question, how do I make our clean energy policies and actions more people-centered, more inclusive, and therefore more likely to deliver what we want them to deliver? And in fact, tomorrow, the Commission will publish its recommendations. And I would invite everybody here today, you're welcome to join us. We have a live streamed event tomorrow afternoon where many Commission members will speak about some of their favorite projects and case studies and experience, and we'll launch the full recommendations tomorrow online. And just to give you a bit of a sneak preview, Nick, the Commission members will make recommendations centered on 4 themes, which I think they have managed to articulate the dimensions of the problematique quite well here. And the 4 themes are, first of all, decent jobs and worker protection, which is something we're very much focused on here today. How to maximize the creation of new jobs, how to protect people who may lose their jobs, how to match skills and needs, thinking about individuals, workers, but also thinking about communities, and of course, investment. The second theme is around social and economic development and how to make sure that policies are fully aligned and there's no risk, either perceptual or otherwise, of contradictions, particularly around questions like energy access for people who don't have energy access, for lifting people out of poverty, and how clean energy can enhance that. The third theme is equity, social inclusion, and fairness. We know there's going to be changes to energy pricing, carbon taxation, there's going to be new regulation. How can we avoid unintended consequences? How can we make sure that the people who need to benefit the most from those policies do so? And how can we make sure that again, we're fully aligned between principles around social inclusion, gender equity, and other questions on clean energy policies. And finally, the fourth theme, which of course is an ingredient across the board, is seeing people as active participants. So this is about people's buy-in to national policies, to global targets, but also questions around acceptance of local infrastructure, acceptance of change, and of course, people as energy consumers and emitters and in their own behaviors. So the Commission will make 12 recommendations across those 4 themes. It's very action-oriented. We believe that previous statements like the ILO guidelines set the principles very well. We're very focused on, so how to turn this into action now? What are the practical learnings from people's experience in countries like Spain, but also in South Africa, in Indonesia, in many parts of the world who've had many successes, also some failures, and how can we learn from all that into making better policy for the future? For me, Nick, it's been really uplifting just to see how much thinking there is on this. There's so much momentum around this agenda, but also putting it in a way that I think Sharan used the word holistic. These are not disconnected issues. These are not separate policy issues. These are really one agenda. And of course, that's challenging for government to do things in a holistic way. Governments tend to divide problems in order to conquer them, and the climate in itself, and particularly climate in a people-centered way, is really going to challenge how we do government, how we do policy making, and how we do societal change. So I think we're at a very interesting moment in how this will work. But I think it also reminds us that this project is nothing if it's not about making people's lives better, if it's not about creating new jobs, if it's not about mitigating the worst impacts of climate that we know we face, if it's not about enhancing social development, improving energy access, but to clean, affordable, secure energy. And I think there's a lot of alignment around those goals. From our point of view, we will launch the recommendations tomorrow. We'll have some very interesting events next week at COP, and really then it's just the beginning of a journey where we start to delve into these issues more deeply with our constituents, particularly with energy and climate ministries, encouraging them to do exactly what Spain has done, to think about just transition strategies as a core part of climate strategies. We don't believe that countries should be plotting net zero roadmaps in the absence of just transition or people-centered strategies as a core part of that. As much as having a technology strategy or a policy strategy, you have to have a people-centered strategy at the core of your mission if you want to deliver, if you want to remember what your goals are, and if you want to deliver successfully on those goals. So Nick, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I would say to everybody joining us today, we're very keen to hear from you all. Please have a look at the recommendations tomorrow. Tell us what you think of them, but also share your experience, share your best practice examples. We'll be continuing to engage on this topic, and we look forward to being part of conversations like this in the future. Thank you, Nick.
Ryan, well, that's really good, and really good to have you here to give us, as you say, that sneak preview. I think many of us will be dialing into your session tomorrow. So thanks so much for that. Fiona, if I could come to you, I think we set this context in the big policy economic sort of debate in a sense, but really I think we'd like to sort of see the role of finance, particularly institutional investors, which you are very, very familiar with, in actually encouraging and supporting the just transition. So I'd really like to hear your views about sort of why investors are really, I think, sort of stepping up on this and what you're looking for in terms of sort of more action going forward. So Fiona, over to you, please.
Sure, thanks Nick, and thanks for having us here today. Well, as you were saying, for the PRI, across our signatory base, we now have 4,300 signatories. They represent 140 trillion in assets under management, so a very large amount of the institutional money that is out there being managed today. And now we see that over half of our signatory base, or not half of our signatory base, but half the assets under management have made net zero commitments. And those net zero commitments can't just be about emissions reductions, as important as that is. People's climate action plans, investors' climate action plans need to be made up from more than that. And we need investors to really be thinking about it's not just about, you know, some mathematical equation about how you reduce the emissions in your portfolio. At the other end of that spreadsheet, there are also people, and we need to have a strong social element, or in my view, we're just not really going to get the transition that we need to happen with the speed that it actually requires. And I think it's fair to say that at the very early stages of investors thinking about climate change, that it was very much just focused on the emissions reduction. But I do think the social side has been scaled up. I still think that there is a lot more to be done when I say this though, but there are some really good investors working on this. I do think that from an investor perspective, if you have to see, you know, a good in anything bad, that COVID-19 really has been a magnifying glass for social issues, and in particular for labour rights, for issues to do with inequality. And I do think that investors are starting to think about social issues, including on the climate side, but not exclusively, in a way they haven't before. And they're understanding the interconnectedness of issues, that you're not going to have a healthy economy and healthy businesses if you haven't got a healthy planet and healthy people. And I think the value of the social issues has really come up the agenda. So, but as I said, that doesn't mean that we don't need to do more. We need to have more ambition from investors on climate change and human rights. And of course, we need investors to think of the interconnectedness of the two parts of the agenda. And this really means understanding which stakeholders need to be involved in setting up climate action strategies, both for companies and for investors, and ensuring that worker representatives, that communities and consumers are consulted, and that beneficiaries also have a say. So going beyond just that conversation with the company is really important for investors. So I think the Just Transition agenda helps investors really connecting the dots, and they can see more action happening from investors on the levers that they can really use to advance the agenda. So just a few things, because a lot's already been said, so maybe a little bit about what investors have been doing. So investors are engaging on the agenda, and a lot has really happened since we released together that first guide for investor action and the statement on an investment commitment to the just transition. We are truly seeing the translation of this commitment into practice across the different levers for action. So in the past year especially, investor action has really accelerated dramatically with, I think, some really welcome steps that have been taken to make sure that the just transition is not just that sort of addendum to the climate agenda, but that it's incorporated throughout the investor action plan. So that includes things like Amundi has launched a Just Transition Fund earlier this year. There's a growing number of examples of successful engagement with investee companies. One that comes to mind was led by the Royal London Asset Management firm. And they engaged with the energy company SSE on the just transition last year. And then that meant that they were able to release the company's just transition strategy. And that was really something that was done in partnership with investors. Also on stewardship, the welcome announcement in June this year of the Investor Coalition Just Transition engagement that's led by Finance for Tomorrow. The French government has backed the organisation, and it's been running for the past 2 years now a task force on the just transition, where investors have been really playing a key role in driving change. And of course, there's the work that the team here at the LSE has been coordinating with the Financing a Just Transition Alliance, bringing together investors, banks and other key stakeholders to concentrate on some of the key areas to translate that commitment of finance to just transition into practice and to real world outcomes, not least by seeking to understand how to finance the place-based needs across the UK, but also across other countries. And this is also translated into an area that we think investors must do further work on, and that's namely engagement with policymakers. So in July this year, a number of Alliance members supported a letter to the Prime Minister in the UK to really urge ambitious policy action around the just transition, and saying that is investors that this is what we support and this is what we want to get behind. I think another really important area that we're seeing changes to is investors also, of course, want to make sure that they're getting the right data to support their work. So again, some positive developments on this front. So PRI is very much part of Climate Action 100+. I'm on the board of Climate Action 100+. We've got a team of staff who work on it. And its importance, I don't think, should be underestimated. It is now the largest engagement on climate that's happening between investors and corporations. Over 600 investors, over 50 billion in assets under management, 50 trillion, I should say. And for the next iteration of the Climate Action 100+ benchmark that we've put out, also has been fleshed out to have more meaningful capture the performance of the companies assessed. So I really think this is going to help investors, and it's going to bring much more focus to the whole issue. So Climate Action 100+, why it's important, focuses on the largest 100 emitting companies in the world. So I don't think it's important. Importance should be underestimated. And joining that, there's been the work of the World Benchmarking Alliance around their just transition assessment methodology, and the upcoming assessment of 180 companies in high emitting sectors that they will release at COP. So I think there is encouraging developments, but we need to see more. We need more investor action across and using those different levers. More place-based initiatives are needed as well, and more collaboration with other actors, including governments and other players in the finance sector. So we do need to see greater and more meaningful engagement with affected stakeholders and their representatives, but it is happening. Not at the speed that I would like. I'd like to see that there is no climate action plan that is put out by any investor that doesn't include a really strong strategy around a just transition. And we're working through the investor agenda on climate action plans, and our aim is just that they all include not just an emissions reduction element, but they also include a strong social element and a strong worker element. And we won't really be successful until we see that happen. But we're moving in the right direction.
Well, fantastic, Fiona, and that's really good. Really good to have those practical examples. And actually, for those of you on the call, the next session in the Just Zero conference, actually at 4 o'clock UK time, we'll have Anne Simpson. Plus, we have the CEO of the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we have representatives of Royal Land and Asset Management and also of Scottish and Southern Energy. We'll go through that engagement. So thank you for talking about that. We've had some really interesting questions as well coming in through the Q&A. Thank you for that. I'll take a few of them, and then I'd really like to get your thoughts before we close on the hour about what you'd like to see from COP, the full panelists. But one of them was about this issue which you were talking about, Fiona, which is about data. And as you know, there's this big concern about sort of ESG, greenwashing, and so on. So maybe if I could turn to you first, Fiona, on that. How do we address that? And obviously then if other panelists want to come in on that. But Fiona, how do we ensure that we don't have sort of, let's say, just transition washing in this process? How do we make sure this is rigorous and has integrity?
Well, I think, first of all, a lot is happening on the social data. Huge amounts we're seeing, as well as having the EU taxonomy, the social taxonomy is being developed. We're doing a lot of work with other organisations on how we get good and meaningful social data, because otherwise investors just tell us there's not enough data, we can't do it, it's all too hard. And we can't have that. But we're also seeing, across the globe that governments are looking at climate data, and we're seeing more regulation and more mandating. So what we need is to make sure that somehow we get harmonized reporting so that it's meaningful and comparable. And that's certainly what we're working on, and we're doing that with why am I having we're working with the business community on making sure that we're joined together in terms of what we want to see from companies, and that investors and business are sitting side by side trying to come up with really good standards in terms of these things. So I do think it is happening, and at the PRI more and more we're incorporating into our own reporting frameworks more and more questions around human rights, social issues, just transition, etc., so that we can see what investors are actually doing. And of course, we're seeing that there is more things happening through the European Commission, through other countries around human rights due diligence. And I think that is going to be really important as well, work that goes forward. So we do make sure that finance, the Paris Agreement including finance, has really effective social safeguards and human rights due diligence in place to ensure that, the respect for the rights of workers and communities are upheld throughout business operations.
Great, thanks very much, Fiona. I'm going to turn to the question. There's one from Tony Balabriga, actually, from BBVA Bank. So it's good to see that the financial engagement of this agenda is not just investors broadening out. And may turn to Brian and Laura, if I may, but really about this whole question of taxation. And obviously we've seen how do we ensure that sort of climate taxation, carbon taxation sort of respects the principles of just transition and fairness and inclusion. So I don't know, Laura, from the work you've done, or indeed Brian from the Commission's work, any sort of practical thoughts about how sort of carbon pricing, carbon taxation can be brought in? And again, obviously, Sharan, if you have any thoughts, but I don't know, Laura, Brian, any on this question? So how we make sort of carbon pricing taxation consistent with just transition principles?
Well, I think we have had in the last years like sufficient examples. Some of them are not like the good examples that we would like to have. So I think we now have much more information about how to embrace these carbon taxation policies, having a good analysis of who is going to be impacted. And as we said before, this is difficult, but we have to be very honest, and we have to look for every single group, every single circumstance that can affect a particular group of people. Doesn't matter if we are not talking just about workers, we are talking about territories, we are talking about people who need. So I think more and more governments are, we are putting attention into that, because it will be like the key success of the carbon taxation policies. And analysis is, of course, very important, but also to have an honest conversation with people, because we will have vulnerable people that we have to address, and we will have non-vulnerable people that we will have to address too. And it doesn't matter, we will have to continue with our carbon taxation policies for these non-vulnerable people, but being also honest that is part of the advancement, and that we have to confront both, putting specific measures for vulnerable citizens, and also having an honest conversation with those that are not vulnerable, and we expect them to be on board.
Great, thank you very much. And Brian, anything particularly on this carbon pricing taxing piece that comes out from your work in the Commission?
It's certainly something we've been looking at, Nick, with the members of the Commission, and I think Laura structures it very well into those 2 points. One is good data for good design, design it well, see how it's going to impact on people. And second is the whole comms thing, and as Laura put it in an honest conversation. It's a bit of a conundrum for me sometimes, because it's a very delicate issue. We know it's very delicate and it often goes wrong, but in theory, it shouldn't be that hard. You just need to design good progressive policies that are well structured, and you need to communicate well. But unfortunately, the failures outnumber the successes probably in this space, because it's always delicate when governments start changing the prices of things. And I think the comms, you're just watching the comms right now, even in your country, Nick, in the UK, where new policies are announced, and 4 pence on a unit of something will make a global headline, but the cost of inaction or the alternatives are not so well discussed. And I think we have to start from a framing that it's not do this or do nothing. The cost of inaction is much higher than the cost of action, and we need to try and have as a rational debate in that space as possible. I'm not sure how easy that's going to be. I think this space is going to become more politicized, more polarized. It's almost a sign of the seriousness of it. When we really get into the deep societal change we're going to have to face up to, it's going to become more contested in many ways. But I certainly think those 2 core principles of intelligent structuring and design and good communication are at the heart of it. And sorry, Nick, just the other dimension of carbon pricing, of course, our energy pricing is fossil fuel subsidies. This is something that is really important in many parts of the world, maybe less so in ours, but not at all irrelevant. And for many countries, they're facing very complex situations where they're very genuinely, firmly committed to reducing fossil fuel subsidies by governments, but they understand the delicacy and the political complexity of that. So there's some very good practice, be it in Indonesia or in certain parts of Latin America or other places where very careful processes have been put in place to reduce fossil fuel subsidies in ways that protect the people they're meant to protect, but still ultimately move away from this model of incentivizing the wrong thing. Thank you.
Brilliant. No, thanks very much. Sharan, please come in.
One of the impediments right now is energy poverty, and it's growing. There's an energy crisis in terms of the cost of energy. We can spend endless hours arguing about why exactly that is, but it's there. And so again, Laura's right, and so is Brian, you have to talk to the people. And carbon pricing, carbon taxation, CBAM, they're all really technical terms, but they can't be indeed implemented in a vacuum of people understanding that the transfer to households, particularly vulnerable households, is part of the design and the equation, so that they're not going to actually have to deal in a poverty environment already with even more impoverishment, particularly coming into winter with heating and cooking and so on. We're big supporters of this. And of course, we understand if you have to transition heavy industry and you have to actually rid yourselves of fossil fuel subsidies, which are keeping alive part of the lack of ambition on transition, that has to happen. There has to be protection mechanisms, and we have to have a pricing on carbon that is actually a disincentive. But the key of it is to say the reason we're doing this is to actually be able to invest in financial transfer to households and investment in the cleaner technologies.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sharon. We're coming up to the hour. This has been a brilliant discussion. I don't know if everybody has 3 more hours, because I'd like 3 more hours. But, I'm coming up to the end, and I'd really like to come to each of you about, again, we put this in the context of COP26, clearly that's starting, and really thoughts about what we need to see out of this vis-a-vis accelerated just transition to net zero. And we have a couple of questions, I think, which might help us sort of kick this off. One is a question about actually, I think we've talked largely in the context of sort of industrialized countries, but really what does this mean for developing countries of Global South? And also, I suppose that this is a whole economy issue. We talked a lot about energy for obvious reasons, but how does this link to questions of land use, agriculture, nature, and biodiversity? So with your closing thoughts, if I can maybe start with you, Fiona, really to, I mean, you I think showed the action that is happening, which is good, nice practical action, but what do we need to see coming out of COP so that your members really pick up the baton when that event is over? Thank you. To you, Fiona.
Well, I mean, I think the list of things that we need to see come out of COP is long, but obviously coming out of COP, we need to make sure that we're seeing very strong 2030 commitments. And what we want to see those from governments, we want to see those from business, we want to see those from the investment community, from everybody. But I think every single plan that is made should be required to have a just transition plan at its heart, so that people are put at the heart of all of these. And coming back to the points that were made before about carbon pricing, I think that's that communications piece. I really do think that if people understood, for example, on carbon pricing, that you were taxing the highest emitters, and this is how the money was being then spent to make sure that this was a fair transition for everybody. But I do think that a lot of the language can get very technical and is not done, you know, and it can get very caught up in climate technical terms as well, without really explaining to people about how this transition would happen. So I would really like those that communicate, particularly world leaders, to be able to talk about this in a way that communicates strongly to people why they need to be behind it, and talks about not just what we're going to lose, not just about the negatives, because there are some negatives, of course, for people. There's change, there's big change coming, but talk about all of the opportunities that are coming our way as well. And there are going to be many opportunities. And I don't think we have enough of that. I think we have a failure of communication completely.
It's a really, really good challenge. And I like this idea that every plan that comes out from the corporate sector, and indeed the financial sector, needs to have clear questions about net zero and so on, but also a just transition plan element. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn to you, Laura, for your closing thoughts, again, about what you're hoping to see come out of COP to add to the momentum around just transition.
I think we have been working in this area for a long time at the international level, and it has been discussed for a long time. And I think it is time to be bold on 2 issues. One is accelerating climate change action, and of course, with strong commitments for 2030 and for full decarbonization. And we have to be bold on that, but we have to be as bold with just transition strategies. And we have to understand, and as Fiona has said, this is not an addenda. We cannot put it like something that is easy and then we put it there. But also we have to understand that just transition strategy is not an instrument for blocking the acceleration. So we have to be honest. It is a very important tool. It cannot be used to block, because otherwise it's not just transition. It cannot be used as an excuse that we are doing things fine and we don't have to think carefully what we are doing. So, and we know, I think most of governments and investors know that both things have to happen at the same time. And I would like to a little bit talk about developing countries. And it's true that we are talking here in a forum, and I'm from Spain. If we want to spread this message, we have to pay attention to social protection. That is key. The real difference between industrialized countries and developing countries in just transition are the social protection tools that we have at our hand. And we have to also help developing countries to strengthen those social protection tools.
Fantastic. And Fiona, thanks for reminding us in the chat. Obviously, we need to get real progress on the 100 billion as a starting point for those international flows. Fantastic. Brian, apart from the launch of the Commission's report tomorrow, the things that we need to see coming out of COP.
Thanks, Nick. And of course, it's not coincidence that the Commission is launching its recommendations tomorrow, because it is an input into COP, and there's going to be a number of ministerial level and other conversations convened around it at COP to really see how we can turn it into real action. Because again, I totally agree with the speakers that another set of abstracted theoretical targets and commitments are not what we need. We need that. People need to see, the world is looking for the sense of seriousness and credibility coming out of COP. And that means not just a target for when we're all dead, but what's going to happen now, how we get on the road. And there's a couple of key tests for seriousness for me. One, as Fiona says rightly, is the finance. There's got to be a real sense of the money is there, including the North-South dialogue that has to be real and tackled head on. And secondly, in the context of this conversation, anybody who's talking about going to net zero and they're not really fully and seriously integrating people-centered dimensions either has forgotten why they're doing it or has no chance of success. So the kind of issues we're talking about today, if they're not centrally strategically planned into people's proposed courses of action, well, then we're not seeing that seriousness.
That's really good. I think some really good touchstones coming out of this. I think the honesty, the seriousness, the planning. And over to you, Sharan, for your reflections on what we need to see in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
Well, I want to go to the developing country perspective because this is, again, seems like the recurring word, but a matter of trust at the COP. First, you have financing, but I also think unless we see just transition, adaptation and mitigation as a common package, and unless we're looking at the kind of changes in the structure of the global economy and financing, one being shared technology. The new climate economy many years ago recommended technology pools. And we're now seeing that, if we'd have solved the vaccine nationalism problem, if we'd have taken that approach and looked at distributed manufacturing virtually from the beginning, but it takes a different approach to global trade and production. And of course, the financing. There is a capacity to finance, not just, of course, the 100 billion, that's a base matter of trust. But if you look at what are we going to do with the special drawing rights, how do we continue with debt relief and debt elimination? What do we do about the corporate base rate of tax and a whole range of other mechanisms that may drive collective finance? Plus, Nick, one we're all committed to, at least I know you and I are, and that is how we, and Fiona as well, how we get an institutional approach to something that will cost very little, if anything, in indeed assuming the risk, the first level of risk, at least, of infrastructure projects, particularly in the developing world. So, sitting down and saying three things. We need to structure a program of finance that aligns with the kind of recommendations that Brian is in fact talking about, and we will collectively promote. And we need to make sure that there are mandatory provisions around transparency in finance that gets us way past the greenwashing, the rainbow washing, whatever it is, so that ESG is genuine everywhere, not just in the areas where it's going to make massive profits.
Fantastic. So thank you so much, Sharan. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Fiona. And thank you to all of you on the line for joining us. It was a great way to kick off this Just Zero conference. We have 5 other sessions, including one later today on shareholders, one focused on emerging economies and developing countries, another focusing on worker and community voice, one focused on the UK, and then we have a final session on Wednesday afternoon, really looking ahead to COP. So thank you all, and we will be posting this, and let's take this momentum forward. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nick. Bye.
Bye.